So we were talking a little bit about the character of Niles and how the brother wasn't originally something that came in later. How did the role of Niles change with casting David Hyde Pierce?
Well, he's very, David is a very, very punctilious, very particular actor. And I remember about the third day of the pilot, we were in a run-through, and Jimmy Burrows, who was directing, gave him a note, which is that when he was approaching the table at the cafe, about to sit down with Frasier, he takes a handkerchief out of his pocket and, wipes off the seat before he sits down. Now, you can spend 2 months writing the words of a pilot, but I think a moment like that said more about the character than just about anything that had been in the script up until that point. Now, not every actor can make a moment like that work. David found a way to just be very sort of precise, and in doing that, the character sort of came to life. I think there were things like that happen all the time that David did, and then you start to say, oh, okay, well he's almost like a dancer, very, very specific and delicate the way he works. We'll start to write to that. But it's always that thing where you write a character and have a certain thing in mind, and then when it's cast, it becomes a completely different thing, and you sort of start writing to the actor's strengths.
How did the character of Maris, his wife, come about? And can you talk a little bit about the decision to keep her from the audience, kind of like with Norm on Cheers and Vera?
Right. I mean, I don't think it was decided from the start that we would never see Maris. But once we started adding on more characteristics, it became a character that couldn't possibly be cast. I mean, she was so thin and so, hysterical, and she would be stomping grapes, but too light to even break the grape's skin. And, the more details we learned about her, it became clear that it was a character that sort of had a different face and picture in everyone's head, and why mess with that by actually putting an actor in the role. And it just became fun to sort of write this slightly fantastical character that only existed in people's imaginations.
What were some of the episodes that you remember most, that you liked the most, and the reasons why?
Well, I mean, I loved a lot of the Niles and Daphne romance episodes. We did one where they had a dance together. Niles had to learn to dance for some event he was going to with Maris, and Daphne volunteered to teach him. And of course, he's burning with desire for her, and they danced together, and they wound up doing a tango. It was very sweet. I loved the episode where they finally kissed at the end of season 7. That was the final episode that I worked on. I did the first 7 seasons of Frasier, and then ultimately came back to do the final season. I loved the finale because it's an opportunity you have very seldom in television to write an ending. You're always sort of either writing a beginning and a pilot, or writing episodes that are just meant to sort of keep the story going, but you very seldom get to write an ending, because usually the network writes the ending for you, which is you're canceled. So I loved that. But I also loved, writing for Kelsey and some of his big extreme moments. I mean, there's a show early on where he encounters Lilith on vacation, and she's in the room next door to him. And she's there with a date, and he's convinced that she's, I think, having sex in the room next door very quietly, almost inaudibly, which is Lilith's style. She's doing this just to make me angry. So I know I'll get back at her. I can give as good as she gives. So he gets up on the bed by himself and grabs the bed frame and starts hammering it against the wall by himself, and getting more and more into it just to drive Lilith crazy on the other side of the wall. And his date, Jo Beth Williams, comes back in and sees him doing this, and it was hysterically funny. I think there were a few of those. I mean, there was one where Frasier decided to resurrect the old radio plays. He found some in the archives of the building and said, "I know, I'll write a radio play, and we'll all perform it with sound effects and things. And he got Niles in to perform and everything else. And he, of course, became very dictatorial as the director of it. It was farcical and big and funny. And we did straight up farces, about once a year, which were, kind of classic, almost French farces with, simultaneous exits and entrances and mistaken identities and stuff. It became a little bit of a hallmark of the show. I loved those episodes. We did one where the challenge was to have no dialogue at all, to just have Niles do about a 7-minute scene where he says nothing, but the setup was he's borrowing Fraser's apartment for a date, and he's got a little time. He's got everything perfect. He's got a meal cooking on the stove, and he looks great, and he's just waiting for her to arrive, and he notices a loose thread on his pant leg, and he decides to overlook it, but of course, being obsessive, he can't, so I can't remember all the steps of it, but I think it was actually a crease in his pants. He takes off his pants, gets out an ironing board, he wants to iron the crease, notices a loose thread, cuts the thread, winds up puncturing his finger, sees blood, he collapses, he faints. There's many steps to it, but ultimately he winds up basically setting Fraser's apartment on fire. But it's 7 minutes of nothing but Niles acting in this set, word-free, and it was fantastic. So we had a range of things, anything from farce to just two guys sitting at a table talking to very heartfelt stuff. I mean, I loved the shows and scenes where Fraser tried to forge a relationship with his dad, who was very much a man of few words and, tight with his emotions, but he would just sort of find a way to chip away at his dad, and those were always sweet.
Were there any storylines that you took from your own life or things that happened to you that you incorporated?
Sure. I mean, there were many of them. When my wife was pregnant with our first child, I bought a, How to Get Ready to Be a Father book, and they mentioned in it that, a common technique for expectant parents is to walk around with a flour sack for a week just to have the experience of having something that you can't let out of your sight. I thought, well, that would be funny for Niles. He does that, but things keep happening to the flour sack. So I wrote that episode, and it wound up airing, I think, 2 days before my son was born. But there were many things over the years. Because my dad worked on the show, I would be thinking of ideas that would be good for the show or possibly good for me to write, but also things that I knew he would get a kick out of writing. Any of the bigger, sort of more frenzied shows he tended to like writing. That radio play one was one of them, and one where Fraser had decided he wanted to compose a new theme for his show, and of course it went completely crazy. Wound up with an orchestra and him conducting a million different sounds was another one. And
so your dad came on as a script consultant in which season?
I think he was there from season 1 because he had been a consultant on Cheers for the prior 11 years. So he just sort of continued on in the same capacity, doing 2 days a week.
What was it like working with him on a show?
Well, it was hard, because he had sort of a perhaps legendary status in the industry at that time, and I was I was still making my way up through the ranks, and by the second season I was more or less in charge of the show, and so I was sort of his, had the final say, which made things even more complicated. But I respected him. He was very good at it, and I looked forward to the days when he would come. He only worked, we would do 10 weeks of pre-production, and then we would start producing the shows, and that was a 5-day schedule, and he would come in for day 1 and day 2 of those 5 days. But sometimes the script would be in trouble, and you'd have, a certain amount of time to turn it around and make it better, and he was very smart and very funny, and I always was happy to see him come in the door because he was going to help us fix it if it needed fixing.
There was a season there where they put Fraser up against Roseanne. What was that like for you as a producer?
Home Improvement or Roseanne?
I think think it was
I remember
Roseanne.
us being up against Home Improvement.
I think it was Roseanne, and then maybe Home Improvement came
Okay.
into the picture.
Well, as I recall, that was season 2. You might remember better than I. We went in the Cheers slot and did quite well. Probably better than a lot of people expected, and felt like, okay, there's a little bit of a relief now because, we are a known commodity now on Thursday nights. And then suddenly they announced, oh no, we're shifting you to Tuesday nights. And everyone got kind of nervous because it's like, okay, now we got to do it all over again. We have to prove ourselves for the second season in a row. So there was a lot of kind of trepidation about it. But I think we did pretty well. I mean, we got better as the season went on. First, it was, middling ratings, but then we were sort of slowly gaining on them to the point where by the end of the season, I think we maybe even eclipsed them. So then I think we had a fair amount of confidence. Like we've shown we can work on either of their 2 nights, move it to Sunday morning, see how we do there.
Now, did you win your first Emmy on Frasier,
Mm-hmm.
for Frasier? It was for writing or for the show?
It was for the show, for best series.
And can you tell us, just describe what that was like for you, winning your first Emmy?
Well, to be honest, I had 2 emotions. I mean, one is the elation that anyone has to win something like that. It's very exciting. But I also grew up in a house where my dad had won a couple of Emmys, so there was a little bit of like, okay, well now I'm halfway to what my dad did. Perhaps not the most gracious emotion, but a real emotion. Primarily though, it was like, well, we worked hard, we put on this show, we're all proud of it, and we just won, and that was really thrilling.
Let's go back and talk a little bit about some of the things you were saying with the episodes, your favorite episodes with Daphne and Niles. Was that a romance or a relationship that you saw initially happening, or did that develop because of the characters and the actors?
It was not envisioned from the start, but after you've done a pilot and you're looking at the kind of daunting task of creating 23 more chapters in the story, you start saying, okay, what's a dynamic to explore? What's going to give us, stuff to have fun with? And the idea came relatively early on that Niles might be sort of transfixed by Daphne because she's so different from Maris. This forbidding, icy, tight kind of presence, and then Daphne's quite opposite. She's, sort of thinks she's psychic and is a little bit inappropriate and English and silly and sexy, and Niles, who's very kind of uptight himself, was just captivated by her, but in a very chaste way. Try to smell her hair or find reasons to sort of touch her, and he was great with it. I mean, so we tried it out in a couple of episodes. The audience loved it. David was brilliant doing it. We thought, well, that's just Money in the Bank. That's going to be fun to write. The challenge then became, how to not repeat yourself in that, how far to take it. And, what began as just this sort of kind of frivolous infatuation became a little bit more meaningful on Niles's part, and then his marriage fell apart. And, and then I think we sensed the audience was sort of rooting for them to get together. Again, it had begun just as this sort of silly thing, this odd character Niles who wanted to smell this English girl's hair, became a real love thing that the audience was rooting for, which was sweet to see.
And John Mahoney playing their father, was he someone that you saw from the get-go playing this part of Martin?
Well, John was a brilliant character actor who started his career relatively late. I think he was in his late 30s or early 40s when he really even was known to anyone. But we all knew him to be a very good actor and a great counterweight in the show. Frasier's this sort of silly guy who lives in his head, and Martin's this, salt of the earth guy who's a cop. John projects that immediately. And so we all loved writing for him. I mean, there was really never anyone else considered for the part. He let it be known he was open to considering it. Peter, David, and David flew to Chicago to have dinner with him to try and convince him to do it. He said yes, and he was on board. But it was a great choice because he was, he lent the show a gravity that the show needed.
Some of the characters from Cheers did wind up on Frasier. Was that something that you always wanted to do, was to bring those characters back? Was that a network?
The network loved it because they were promotable. The producers liked it because it was fun. And it made sense that these people that Frasier had spent 9 years of his life with might come for a visit. Personally, I got a kick out of it because I'd never worked on Cheers but was a huge fan of the show, and here was my chance to actually write dialogue for Lilith or Sam Malone or Woody Boyd. But we didn't want to overdo it. I think the network would have been thrilled if we had him come 2 or 3 times a year. We had sort of a standing 1 per year limit on it. We might have done Lilith more than once a year, but that was a particular thing because they had a child in common, and you could justify that. But they were fun. It was always fun to have them, and the audience would go crazy. I remember the first time Ted Danson came to do a table reading, the episode that he did. He was quite kind of unnerved because it was the first time he'd been back to the stage. We did the Frasier on the same sound stage that they had shot Cheers on, and he was very kind of nervous playing Sam again. And then he relaxed into it, and he was great in the episode. But it was interesting to see that. He was with a little bit of a you can't go home again feeling for him, and he was sort of, a little frightened, I think, but then it was great.
Were there any of the other actors like that? Because Shelley Long also came on to play Diane. Did you get a sense that it was kind of that same thing, getting back into the character?
It was, but I think it was hardest for him. Shelley had been away from her character for a long time because she was only on Cheers for the first, 4 or 5 seasons. But she was great. She went right back into it. We wrote a thing where she has a little twitch, and that's something that had been written into Cheers, 10 years earlier. So it was sort of fun to reintroduce that little quirk of her character. When we did Woody, we actually had trouble with that script and wound up doing a pretty heavy rewrite in the middle of the week and making it much more of a heartfelt episode. So there was a little kind of trouble in the middle of the week where he thought about walking out on us and not doing the episode. And he was somewhat justified because it just wasn't a great script, but it wound up being a pretty good script because we worked all weekend changing it and getting it right.
There were a lot of celebrities that lent their voices as the callers into Frasier's radio show. Was that an idea that you had, to have these voices that we would maybe recognize?
Again, it's something that built. And I have to give credit here to the creators, Casey Lee and Angel. Their approach was, we need to find some way to make the show just a little bit different. Not radically different from what you're used to seeing, but a little bit different. 2 ways that came to mind were not using stock shots. That was always a, sitcom staple. When you're changing locations, you go to the exterior of the building, then you go inside. No stock shots on Frasier. We'll just use those black cards with the white letters that sort of give you a transitional piece. And another was the voices to the radio station. I think early on, we thought, well, that's different. You're not used to having so many voiceovers in a show. But if the show catches on and it becomes sort of a cool thing for people to do, it might be fun to have, people be guessing whose voice was that. Was that just Carl Reiner, or was that just, whoever the person of the week was. And it worked that way. People kind of got a kick out of that.
How would you say the relationships between, especially Frasier and his father, how did those relationships evolve over the course of the show?
Well, in the pilot, they are harsh with each other. His father's ornery. He's just been shot. He's coming in the house. He doesn't really want to be there. And Frasier is equally angry because he says, I have my freedom now. I'm coming to Seattle, and I've just, I'm starting a new career, and I feel like I'm being reborn. And the next thing you know, I've got my father who's coming in with this nasty attitude, and he's also coming in with a chair that I hate and a dog that I don't like, and on top of that, this crazy therapist. This freedom has been completely yanked away from me, And they both were justified in being sort of angry with each other, and it culminates in a sort of a shouting scene where they're legitimately mad with each other. And that's quite atypical in a sitcom, to see a largely dramatic scene that ends with a slammed door and real hurt feelings. And it was chancy. They repair it a little bit at the end of the episode, enough that the audience felt satisfied at the end that they're not still mad at each other, but that left us room to go in the series, which you absolutely need. So that they stayed sort of frosty, but they took little steps toward coming together through the course of the show. And I think that was key. I mean, again, it's a matter of giving the audience something to root for, and I think the audience always sort of was rooting for Niles and Daphne to get together, was rooting for Frasier and his dad to connect a little bit better than they had at the beginning. Those are all very relatable emotions.
How about the relationship between Roz and Frasier? Was that ever envisioned as a romance? I mean, they eventually did just have like a one-night thing, but was that ever, or did you purposely stay away from them getting romantic?
I think if any relationship had been envisioned at the beginning, it probably was Roz and Frasier more than Niles and Daphne. But for some reason, they seemed better as friends, as she was someone who could puncture Frasier's balloon a little bit. She was funny as kind of this slightly slutty girl that told a bunch of funny stories about her dating life, and probably wasn't really attracted enough to a guy like Frasier, who lived so much in his head, was a better friend than she would have been a romantic interest for him. It just evolved that way. I mean, they were great in that relationship that they had, but probably wouldn't have been so great as an actual couple. I think they flirted with it one time. They were away for a convention or something, and they wound up having to share a hotel room, and they sort of contemplated it, because this is usually what happens on television shows, especially when people are thrust in a hotel room together, but realized it wasn't right for them, and I think that was the right decision. It never felt right.
What about the love interests that Frasier had? He had many love interests over the course of the show. Did you have any favorites or any favorite guest stars in that role?
We did one with Celia Ward, where this was based upon a story that someone told in the writer's room, where he was dating someone, and he couldn't believe how lucky he was to be dating someone this hot, and he kept trying to find a way to take a picture of them together so he'd have the evidence, because he was so sure that she was going to break up with him. So we thought, well, that's something we have to do with Frasier. So he meets this supermodel played by Celia Ward, and the trick of the episode was he's always by himself when he's with her, and absolutely no one will believe that he's actually dating this woman. So he keeps trying to get evidence of it, and he finally winds up in bed with her, and she's falling asleep on his arm, and he notices a camera off on sort of the bedside table, and he's trying to slide his arm out from under her enough so that he can get the camera, so that he can finally take a picture of himself in bed with her, which is awful. But he did, and then the flash wakes her up, and she realizes what's happened, and she's furious with him, and she goes sort of running out of the house, and he's once again lost his chance to demonstrate for people that he was actually dating this woman. There's more to it, but it was funny. That was a great one.
How about Martin, giving him a love interest with Marsha Mason, who came on, I think, just for that one season?
Well, look, that really is a function of storytelling. I mean, you have to give characters goals, and one of the main goals is to find love in life, as in fiction. So, it seemed natural to try and put him on that track. We like the idea of someone a little bit bawdy and rough around the edges, because that would, not sit well with Frasier and Niles, who are so, kind of manners conscious. And she was great. She played that part really well, and I think got a kick out of making them squirm. And I think that I can't remember how many we did with her, 6 or 7 maybe, but it was good. It was good to see this gruff character Martin have the softer side where he's falling for someone a little bit, and I think the audience enjoyed seeing him get a little happiness for a while there.
So why did you decide to leave Frasier? I think it was in the 7th season, right after the 7th season.
I was just really burned out from it. I mean, I loved the experience. I couldn't have asked for more. We won a bunch of Emmys.
Okay, so where we left off talking about, you said you were a little bit burned out on Frasier, and it decided to...
Well, yeah, 7 seasons, probably 180 or so episodes. We'd won the Emmy 5 years in a row, the first 5 seasons the show was on. And I really, at that point, started to feel like, wow, I don't know where this show can go under my leadership, but down. And that's a bad feeling to have. As much as I loved writing for those characters and loved the actors and the life of it, it is a lot of pressure to do 24 episodes a year. But it's even more pressure when you've sort of lost sight of what your next goal might be. That the only thing that seems possible is the show getting less good. You're sort of like you're just bailing water, like trying to keep the show from being less good. That's a sort of the opposite of the goal. And so it became tough. And by the 7th season, I think I said, I gotta take a break from this. And so I did, and the last episode that I wrote with a partner, Joe Keenan, who had been on our staff at that point for 6 seasons, was the episode in which Niles and Daphne finally sort of get together. It's Niles. I guess Daphne at that point was engaged to a guy that Niles had inadvertently introduced her to, a guy that Niles had hired to be his defense lawyer in his nasty divorce with Maris. Daphne and he get together, and Niles sort of has a moment of truth where he confesses to her that he's had these feelings for her all these years, and they kind of ride off into the sunset at the end of season 7. So it seemed like a great way to conclude my time on Frasier, even if it made a mess for the people who came to Frasier after me, because one of the great threads that had been sort of explored in the first 7 seasons now wasn't a thread anymore. Daphne and Niles were together. There was nothing to root for anymore there, but that was somebody else's problem.
Did you think you would go back, or did you feel like you really were done with it at that point?
I felt that I was done with it. I suppose in the back of my mind, I always thought, having been there from the beginning, that it would be very gratifying to find a way to end the series, because again, you just don't get to do that very often. But by that point, the show was still going strong, and the end was nowhere in sight. And if it was going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 more years, I knew I didn't have it in me to stay that length of time. So I was content to be away from it and have a slightly easier life and trying to develop a new show, which is what I did.
And what was the show that you developed?
Well, because Joe Keenan was leaving at the same time, his contract was up, same as mine, we decided to partner. I mean, we were originally going to write, develop our own things. And then because we developed a shorthand and a good working relationship on Frasier, we thought, well, why not try to write something together? So we did write a pilot about an inn in New England, which was called The Seven Roses, which we couldn't cast. We spent weeks and months trying to cast the parts. We had a few elements in place. We had Brenda Blethyn to play this mother who lives there, and John Cryer was going to, I think, he was in contention to play a part, and Kristen Chenoweth was cast, but we couldn't find our lead guy, and finally the thing just sort of languished, and the next year we moved on to a whole new idea. And that idea was called Bram and Alice, about this sort of reclusive writer who, maybe is a bit of a drunk and a womanizer who's living off of his great one success, sort of a J.D. Salinger character, but a little more dissolute than that, who is reunited with a daughter that he never knew that he had. And we found 2 great actors for it. Alfred Molina played Bram, and Traylor Howard played Alice, and they had a wonderful chemistry, and there was a lot to explore in that relationship. But I think our problem was there wasn't enough else going on in the show. We didn't have, enough other relationships to explore. So we made the series. It was on CBS for, I think we wound up making maybe 13 of them or something like that, 9 of them. But it was misbegotten. There just wasn't enough built in to explore.
So then you did end up going back to Frasier for the last season. Did you know, was that the reason? Did you know it was going to be the final season and you wanted to go back to end it?
We did, but it was not, the producers, David and Peter by that point, because David Angel had died on September 11th, approached me and said, what would you think about coming back for the final season? And approached Joe as well. And it was very hard to say no to that. I mean, I'd come off of a failure in Bram and Alice, and Frasier will always have a very, particular place in my heart. And here was that thing that I had always wanted, which was to find a way to bring the show around to a satisfying end. And I certainly, I think that there is more fun in an end season than there is in just another middle season. So even if I felt a little burned out, you can always get it up to do the last season because there's particular challenges there. So I was thrilled, and we wound up getting a lot of the writers back together that had been with the show in early seasons, and it was a thrill.
So that last season, what were some of the stories that you wanted to tie up or things that you wanted to tell that you felt that hadn't been told?
Well, I think we wanted to find a way to launch people into lives that seemed satisfying to the audience, that they were going to be okay beyond the end of the series. But we didn't want to do that in too pat a way. So there was a certain amount of sort of experimenting with new lines of work for Frasier. Is he going to go into private practice? Should we get him in kind of a romance? I think we tried him in a few relationships early on in the season. Same with Martin. I mean, we introduced a relationship with Wendy Malick, this sort of lounge singer that was that he'd always had an eye for, and wound up getting them together. I mean, Daphne and Niles. We wanted to, I think, start a family and just sort of say, okay, well, it would be fun to imagine what that whole journey for them will be like. And then ultimately the big question is, where do you leave Frasier? Is he on the air at the end, or is he off to sort of explore new horizons, which sort of mimicked where he was at the end of Cheers. If Frasier began with him landing in Seattle and starting a new life, we ultimately like the idea of the end of Frasier being him sort of moving on to the next adventure, which is what it was.
And how difficult was it to write the very last episode of Frasier?
Well, it was difficult and exhilarating at the same time. I mean, when you're actually, typing the words, Frasier, Frasier says goodbye to his radio audience for the last time. It's scary in a way because, not to make this too dramatic, but people cared about him and cared about that show, and to live with the guy for 11 years, and this is really the end of something. We wrote a sort of a farewell scene where he hugs each one of them, and you think, well, gosh, I mean, this is why people are going to tune in, to see what it's like for Frasier to hug his brother Niles for the last time. How do you get that right? And so there was pressure in that. I'll tell you, we made a huge mistake in the writing of that episode because we didn't give John Mahoney a goodbye with Frasier. And John, who's very polite to a fault, in a run-through came up and said, do you think I could have a goodbye with Frasier? I don't know why we didn't do this. It just makes perfect sense. Roz had said goodbye to him, and Niles did, and Daphne, and and I guess they had a hug or something, but there wasn't really a moment. And we said, "Oh my God, of course." And it wound up being more what he doesn't say than what he says, but he just says thanks for for everything. And what he was really referring to is taking him in at all in the first place, which was perfect. And all the credit belongs to John because they played it beautifully. But anyway, it was very fun to write it because the first part of the show was very farcical and big. And we have a cast of thousands. Anthony LaPaglia, who played Daphne's brother, in several episodes came back, and he had two other brothers with him, Robbie Coltrane, and this big sort of rollicking guy that spoke in this language that you couldn't actually ever understand what he was saying. And Wendy Malick was in it, and Laura Linney, who was playing Frasier's love interest at that point. And it was an hour-long episode with a million scenes, and there was a wedding and cannons getting shot off and all kinds of craziness. But then it also got sort of very small in the places that it needed to. The last scene I thought was great. I mean, it has Frasier sort of making a decision, we think, to go pursue a new job in San Francisco. And Kelsey had come up to us and said, there's this poem that I think is very apt. It's always meant a lot to me. Maybe Frasier might quote from that poem in his last radio broadcast. And then we thought, okay, well, we can try that, and then maybe there's a way that what he says in this poem actually inspires him to make his final decision, which is, does he go to San Francisco, or does he go to pursue the girl who's gone to Chicago? And maybe we can leave that as a surprise for the end, really lead the audience to believe that he's actually going to pursue the job, and only at the very final beat do you realize he's said, to hell with career, I'll go chase the girl. And so it was exciting to write that moment. I think the audience liked it, but pressure that comes with that too, because everybody had their own idea and desire for how the show should end, and you can't please everybody.
Why was Laura Linney's character Charlotte? Why was she the one that he would pursue like that?
Well, she was a matchmaker, as I recall, and so I think there was sort of a simpatico between them because they both spent a lot of time sort of thinking about people's problems and how to make people happier in life without necessarily making themselves happy. So they seemed like a good match, but they just had a very sweet chemistry. I mean, they say goodbye early in that episode. She leaves, and he's left. She leaves. They've had sort of a kind of a curt hug and goodbye, and then she comes back and runs and jumps in his arms because she couldn't leave sort of in that too cold a way. And when you saw that moment, you went like, wow, they really look good together. And so I think the audience maybe said, like, Frasier is really feeling something for this woman that he hasn't felt for a lot of other women in the show. I mean, again, Laura's a wonderful actress, and then a lot of it comes down to chemistry, but they looked good together. So had they not, I don't know what we would have done, because we sort of were committed to that ending at that point. But, she's smart, she's funny, she's pretty, a lot of the things that Frasier needs. And she certainly is warmer than Lilith, which is the last woman we saw him with. So I think we were happy for him.
What was it like shooting the last episode and being on the set with everyone for the last time?
Cheers had shot its final episode second to last because they didn't want a lot of the emotion of, it's over to be sort of spilling into. So we'll shoot that second to last, and then we'll just shoot a random episode that might be fifth to last, so that if the emotion of everybody facing the end mars it a little bit, it won't matter so much. We thought about that, but because it was an hour and we had all these guest people, we were sort of stuck with, we're going to shoot the last one last. And there was a lot of emotion. Man, there were tears at the table reading, and Kelsey had hired a photographer to kind of record the entire week, which he later turned into beautifully bound albums that he handed out to everyone. But the cast had announced about a month earlier that as a Christmas present to the entire company, they were taking everyone to Hawaii for 3 days. So there was less of a finality to it than there might have been, because they literally had jets hired and they booked an entire hotel in Hawaii, and 100 of us were going to go together. We filmed on Tuesday or Wednesday, and then we got together at the airport Friday and went to Hawaii for 4 days. So that kind of helped with it, because we knew our goodbyes were going to take place later. But still, there were moments where everybody got kind of caught up, and then when we finally ended it, everybody sort of swelled onto the stage. But you could sort of see people going like, "Wow, they're going to tear the set down tomorrow," and this is really it. And certain people were sort of eyeing certain items on the set that might look good on their shelf at home, and I could actually show you Fraser and Niles' sherry glasses that sit on my shelf in the next room if you'd like. I copped that night. But it was emotional. I think that's a credit to how much pride we all took in the show and how much we loved those characters and the whole experience.
What was it like working with Kelsey Grammer?
It was great. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better setter of tone. I mean, he was a great leader. He knew he had standards that needed to be met. He let that be known. But he also kept the pressure off. I mean, there's some people who are leads who let you know they're under pressure and put everybody else under pressure and feel stressed because they're feeling stressed. He never did that. He probably felt more stressed than he let on, but he was always sort of singing a song and keeping it light and encouraging people. And that's just his personality. In terms of his talent, there's nobody better. I mean, he can be ridiculous, farcical, crazy, jumping on a bed and slamming against the wall 1 minute, and then heartbreaking the next. And you can't ask for anything more than that. When you have that range, as a writer, you're never going to be hamstrung at all, because he's going to be able to do anything you write.
Was he your favorite to write for? Did you have a favorite to write for on that show?
I don't know that I had a favorite. I mean, I certainly loved writing for Fraser for that reason, that he could go anywhere with the stuff, and he would always surprise you. I mean, like hairpin turns he would do in attitude, the sharpness of his delivery, but also the way he could just touch you was thrilling. I mean, I think we all sort of took more credit than we deserve, because you write a speech that's a pretty good speech, and he made it a great speech because Kelsey is Kelsey, and then you sort of say, well, hey, I wrote a great speech. Well, you wrote a pretty good speech, and he made it great. I mean, David had many of the same qualities, and as a tandem, you couldn't ask for any better. They were just brilliant together.
You mentioned earlier about David Angel being killed in the 9/11 attacks with his wife Lynn. Can you share with us what you remember about learning that he was on the plane and what you went through during that time?
Well, I think everyone who remembers that day remembers being a little bit in shock, which is a good thing because you're a little bit braced. We were everyone, watching television and sort of only half perceiving what we were seeing. So I think for that reason, I was a little bit anesthetized when I learned that first David and Lynn were on a plane that had left Boston, as had one of the other planes that went into the World Trade Center. It happens that my parents were on a plane on the same tarmac, leaving 2 planes behind David and Lynn's plane. So there was a lot of anxiety that day when we learned that they went into the second tower, which we didn't find out about until a couple of hours later. It was awful. You try to imagine and try not to imagine what it must have felt like to be them in that moment. Then I was just personally trying to find out what was going on with my parents. They were heading for Europe, and before too long we realized that they were fine. But it was awful. He was a sweet man. His wife was too. Not a sweet man, a sweet person. They were a wonderful couple. He was a classic sort of man of few words, a New Englander, liked to think a long time before he said anything, which meant that the things he said were usually funny or helpful. There are a lot of people that just talk and talk and talk until they say something that's funny or smart. He would think before he would say something, and it was usually funny or smart. And it was a pleasure working with him.
What would you say is his contribution to television?
Well, he was a longtime contributor to Cheers, and certainly brought his wit and his sort of New England, lack of flash, but great substance to that show. He went on to create Wings, which was a hit television show which ran 8 years, and then went on to co-create Frasier, which is, by most people's estimation, a classic show. So, I guess he only worked in television for 15 years or so, but that's a tremendous contribution in that period of time.
What is the legacy of Frasier, the show?
Well, I think that it was a very funny show and a smart show, and those things don't exist simultaneously that often. We won a lot of awards. We got a lot of credit for that stuff, but I think the show had a real heart to it, and it may have reminded people that that while being funny is good, to have a sort of an undercurrent of emotion and heart is a very good thing, and shows that try to imitate that have a better chance of succeeding, in my opinion. It's really more for other people to judge what makes it a classic than me, but I just think it was beautifully acted and well written, and the fact that people are still watching it now, 15, almost 20 years since it debuted, says it was a well-made product.
And what did you do after Frasier? What show did you do after that Frasier ended?
The first year after Frasier ended, I went back into development once again with Joe Keenan, because while we hadn't had any successes, we enjoyed working with one another, and we created a show called Out of Practice. I think we wanted to do a family show, and probably applying that theory that going to the extremes might lead to something a little bit more unique. We decided to write a show about a family, all of whom are doctors, mother and father who are actually recently divorced, and 3 grown kids, all of whom are doctors. That was called Out of Practice.
And that show lasted for one season?
One season. We were on CBS, and Stockard Channing and Henry Winkler played the leads, who were both excellent. Ty Burrell and Chris Gorham played brothers, and forgetting the name of the actress who played the sister.
Paula Marshall.
Paula Marshall, it now comes to me, played the sister, emergency room doctor. It was, I think it was pretty well done. We were in that sort of limbo place where we were doing well, but not quite well enough, so that CBS had other shows that they felt might do better than we had done. So they took us off after 17 because they were hot to try a show with, Jesus, I'm forgetting her name. Who was Dharma of Dharma and Greg?
Jenna Elfman.
Jenna Elfman. Please cut out these sections where I look like I'm 70 years old. Jenna Elfman. They were sure that this show with Jenna Elfman was going to be a big hit because Les Moonves loved Jenna Elfman, and so they took us off, put her show on. It didn't do well. In fact, it did far worse than we had done, but by that point they couldn't put us back on. So we did respectably in the ratings. We did a full season. I think we aired 17 of them, and over a 2 or 3 year period at CBS, we were one of their better performing sitcoms, apart from Raymond and I guess 2.5 Men, which was just starting around that same time. But because there was sort of a lack of real flash or anything particularly exciting about the show, it never quite caught on with the CBS brass the way we would have liked for it to.
And then what about after that, after Out of Practice?
Well, Out of Practice sort of ended my contract at Paramount, where I'd been for 17 years. And a guy that I had worked with early on for a year on Wings, and then the better part of a year on Frasier, Steve Levitan, but who had been a friend, was also at the end of a contract. And so he came to me and said, well, what do you think about starting a company where we maybe develop things together, but also supervise other writers? Because we each had been, close to 20 years in the business at that point, around. And so we thought, well, there's lots of people who maybe would benefit from our experience, take younger writers, give them notes, help to shape something, but again, maybe write some stuff together. So I said, sure, it seemed like a interesting way to go and for the next chapter. So we made a deal with Fox, started developing things, and about halfway through the first year of that deal, came up with an idea that seemed like it might be good for Kelsey Grammer. So went to him, not at all sure he was ready to come back to television, pitched it to him. He immediately said he wanted to do it, where he played an anchor man who has, had one time had a, sort of a career on the rise, who's now had a bit of a scandal and is coming back to a place where he had previously worked. Originally it was Buffalo, then it became Pittsburgh. The show was called Back to You. He has a co-anchor, a female, with whom he's had sort of a romance, on again, off again. We got Patricia Heaton to play that part, and the whole thing came together kind of quickly. We had a great supporting cast. Ty Burrell, whom I had worked with on How to Practice, came on that show. Fred Willard, a wonderful cast. Ida Field, who played this sort of ditzy weather woman. Jimmy Burrows came on as our director. So we had all the pieces in place. We really felt it just was the wrong network. I mean, Fox was not ready for a traditional kind of show like that. I mean, we did a full season. They, in fact, ordered a second season, then reneged on that. But it probably should have been on CBS. It felt like a CBS show. CBS even said this show belongs on our network. Our deal was at Fox. We got a lot of pressure to take it to the Fox network. It just was a shotgun marriage that ended the way most shotgun marriages end, which was with a lot of people being unhappy.
Did you think that there was any, that audiences had any trouble seeing Kelsey as another character because he was Frasier for so long?
I think so. I think that's a built-in challenge when you use someone who's so closely associated with a particular character. There's no way of measuring that. Certain people who've moved on. I mean, Ted Danson's done a number of series. He did Becker after Cheers, and audiences accepted him that way. But I do think that it was very tough for Kelsey that way because people wanted more Frasier and the character wasn't Frasier. But he's such a gifted actor that he could make the material work that we gave him. But we were always up against that a little bit.
Okay, so let's move on to your current show, Modern Family. And can you describe the premise of Modern Family and tell us a little bit about the development between you and Steve?
One second. Steve and I wanted to write something different, having done a more traditional, maybe old-fashioned show and Back to You. We wanted to do something that seemed a little more contemporary, but at the same time we wanted to write about families, which is not contemporary. There's been a million family shows done over the years. So the challenge became, how do you do a family show in a different way? So then we thought, well, maybe this documentary approach is a good start because it enables you to do sort of direct-to-camera interviews, and the whole style of it might just give it a different look. The audience might feel as though they're observing something that they're not necessarily supposed to be observing, a little bit more of a voyeuristic kind of experience. Then what about the families? Well, we've certainly seen the family sitcom where there's the oafish husband and the wife that's got the wooden spoon shaking it at the oafish husband, and like, oh, it's so done. And what is the American family anymore? What is the typical family anymore? So I thought, okay, well, we'll write around that. We'll write several different types of family: traditional family, stay-at-home mom, working dad, 3 kids. Then another common type of American family, the guy in his second family, divorcee, a little bit older with a younger wife. Maybe she's got a kid. And then a third type of family, a gay couple who've just adopted a baby, Vietnamese baby in this case. Okay, well, that starts to sound interesting, but how are you going to do this where you're jumping from family to family? It's going to feel very disjointed. Well, what if we could find a way to have them all be united and maybe even save that as a big surprise for the end of the show? What if the divorcee is, in fact, the dad of the wife in the traditional family and one of the guys in the gay couple? And so there's this sort of one bigger family that arches over these other 3 families. Once we came up with that idea, I think we said, okay, well, this feels like a series and will enable us to do a family show, which again feels quite traditional, but it will look different, and the storytelling will be a little bit different.
How long did it take you through the whole development process, getting it ready to write?
I think about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. I don't know. It was. There's always a lot of discussion, and we went down a lot of bad roads. But when we finally settled on writing about family and a documentary approach, we had a character who was the documentary filmmaker, and this character was meant to be a Dutch filmmaker who had been an exchange student who lived with the family when he was a kid 20 years ago. And he always referred to them as my American family because of the summer he spent with them or the year he spent with them. And now he's realized they've gone off into 3 new families, and he wants to make a documentary about the American family and thinks they're the perfect people to make a movie about. And so the series was called My American Family. But then it became too cumbersome to include that documentarian, so we jettisoned that. Once we sort of got through all this discussion and actually figured out who our 3 families were and had a loose idea of the structure, at what point in the pilot we reveal that they're all part of one family. The actual writing of it is 2 weeks or something like that, 2 or 3 weeks, but probably 2 months of thinking and plotting before we got to that point.
Did you pitch it to ABC initially?
We pitched it to CBS, NBC, and ABC. We wanted nothing to do with the Fox network after our experience with them. So we pitched it to those 3 networks and got a very good response. CBS was interested. They didn't do a lot of single camera comedy, so they were interested but a little bit unsure. NBC also interested, but they had The Office, and they may have been in the early stages of Parks and Recreation at that point, which was also a sort of a mockumentary approach. So they were intrigued, but less intrigued than ABC. All 3 bid on it. ABC wanted it the most. We pitched it to them with a big sort of PowerPoint presentation, and they bought it immediately and aggressively. So and we're quite enthusiastic about it. So we said, well, you always want to be with someone who wants you the most. So we signed up with them, and we're happy to have done so.
Okay, we're going to take another quick break.